You don't need a tyrant to kill a republic. You just need permission. Sit with that for a second. Because in the movie version of this story, Rome falls to a dictator with an army, some Caesar or Sulla, a man on horseback taking power by force. And that's the myth we all grew up with. What actually happened is that the first real wound to the Roman Republic got struck by the senators themselves, beating a man to death with the broken legs of their own furniture. 133 BC on the Capitol. For more than 3.5 centuries, ever since the tribunate was created around 494 BC, no sitting tribune of the plebs had been touched by his own government, let alone killed. These men were sacrosanct, untouchable under the law, and any citizen could legally kill you on the spot for so much as laying a hand on one. And on the day Tiberius Gracchus stood for re-election, all of that protection dissolved in about 10 minutes. Scipio Nasica, the Pontifex Maximus, Rome's own chief priest, led them. They snapped the legs off their benches. They beat Tiberius Gracchus to death, along with something like 300 of his supporters. And then they threw his body into the Tiber like a common criminal, with no burial and none of the rites. The moment that first bench leg came down on his skull, the Roman Republic entered a phase it would never really leave. And what actually killed it wasn't any single act. It was 3 fault lines cracking in sequence: money, borders, and power, all failing at once. A land crisis nobody wanted to fix. A recruiting collapse that nobody wanted to admit. And an office, the tribune's veto, that got weaponized until it stopped protecting the very people it was built for. Every Roman strongman who came after, for the next 100 years, Marius, Sulla, Caesar, could look back at this one afternoon and basically say, well, it's already been done. This is the first stone falling out of the arch. Welcome back to The Roman Pattern. I'm your host, Jeremy Ryan Slate, the CEO of Command Your Brand. Check us out over at commandyourbrand.com. And now, our story. 133 BC, the Capitol. Broken benches, snapped off legs, senators pouring out of a Senate meeting to go attack an election that's already underway. For over 3.5 centuries, since the office was created around 494 BC, no sitting tribune had been killed by his own government. Tribunes of the plebs were personally sacrosanct, physically untouchable under the law. If you so much as touched a tribune, any Roman citizen could legally kill you for it, and no trial was required. The protection was written into the constitution on purpose, though Rome's constitution wasn't written, because tribunes existed specifically to shield ordinary Romans from the Senate overarching. And on the day Tiberius Gracchus went for re-election, that constitutional protection dissolved in about 10 minutes. The Pontifex Maximus, Scipio Nasica, led a group of senators out of a meeting where they just failed to talk the presiding consul into acting, and they snapped the legs off the benches they'd been sitting on. They walked over to where the assembly was gathering. They beat Tiberius Gracchus and about 300 of his supporters to death, and they threw his body into the Tiber like a criminal. Plutarch actually gives you the specific detail here. The bench legs and boards, the improvised clubs, senators killing with their own hands. The moment that first bench leg came down on his skull, the Republic entered a phase that it would never leave. Everything that came later, Marius raising a personal army, Sulla marching on Rome, Caesar crossing the Rubicon, all of it became unimaginable because it had already been done in a miniature on that very day. And it wasn't really that specific act that mattered so much as the deep thing underneath it. The informal rules holding the whole system together for 4 centuries could actually be broken, and the response would be violence. And nothing outside the system was going to step in and stop it. This is the direct sequel to what we covered last time. In episode 113, we showed you how the machine was actually built. The mos maiorum, the unwritten rules. That Cincinnatus example of a man who's handed absolute power and just gives it back. That episode ended by pointing at this exact moment as where the next chapter begins. So here we are. This is the first stone falling out of the arch. And I want to get the scale right before we go any further, because this really isn't a footnote in Roman history. Historians treat 133 BC as the conventional starting point for what gets called the Roman Revolution, a whole century of escalating internal violence that only ends once Augustus is holding sole power. And Appian saw it the same way. He opens his entire history of Rome's civil wars by pointing right at this killing, the first time, as he puts it, that an internal Roman quarrel got settled by murdering a citizen inside the city. Before Tiberius, the sword stayed out of the forum. After him, it really never left. And every future episode in this arc is just tracing one more layer, breaking off the same structure that cracks right here. So the first thing to throw out is the idea that this guy is some outsider, a firebrand who came out of nowhere. Tiberius Gracchus is the grandson of Scipio Africanus, the man who beat Hannibal at Zama and ended the Second Punic War. His father, also named Tiberius, was consul twice and a censor, one of the most decorated careers in all of Rome. His mother Cornelia is one of the most famous Roman matrons in history, and you may already know "These Are My Jewels" story, where she points to her sons instead of her gold when a visitor asks to see her wealth. Cornelia personally ran the education of Tiberius and his brother Gaius, bringing in Greek tutors, and later generations of Romans held her up as the model of what an aristocratic mother should be. So this is a household sitting just about at the dead center of Roman power, about as far from the margins of Roman society as you can possibly get. He comes out of the very highest tier of Roman aristocracy there is, and that's a big part of why this lands so hard. He's the opposite of some rabble-rouser dragged out of the street. When a Senate kills him, it's killing one of its own, a man whose bloodline was supposed to guarantee he'd defend their interest rather than challenge them. So what radicalizes a man with that kind of pedigree? Around 137 BC, on his way back to a military posting over in Spain, Tiberius rides through Etruria, the Roman countryside north of Rome, and Plutarch records what he sees: fields being worked by imported slave labor, and almost no free citizen farmers left anywhere. The small farmers, Rome's traditional citizen soldiers, the men who'd filled the legions for centuries, are just gone. In their place, you've got the latifundia, these massive estates worked by slaves who were captured in Rome's own foreign wars, the very conquest that made these families rich in the first place, and the thing that feeds itself. The wars produced the slaves work the stolen public land, and the stolen land pushes out the very soldiers that Rome needs to go fight the next war. And this is really a national security story, every bit as much as a land story. Rome recruits its legions from the assiduii, land-owning citizens who meet property qualifications. So if a man has no land, he doesn't qualify. And without qualifying men, there's no army. And the census rolls from this stretch of the 2nd century tell you the same thing in the aggregate. The citizen count stops climbing and even starts to drift downward. Historians still argue over exactly what those numbers prove, but the direction of the travel is the part that matters, because the recruiting base is quietly eroding while the Senate looks the other way. And it looks the other way because the men getting rich off the latifundia are the same men who'd have to vote to fix any of it. And the land underneath all of this, the ager publicus, this state-owned public land won through conquest that technically belongs to the Roman people as a whole, has been illegally grabbed by senatorial families for their own estates, generation after generation, to the point where squatting on public land has become basically indistinguishable from owning it. Now, the part people tend to get backwards is this. Tiberius's actual reform is strikingly modest. His actual proposal is almost boringly narrow. What he wants is for Rome to finally start enforcing a land law it already has in the books. And he isn't calling for any new land seizures. And he isn't trying to touch a single acre of genuinely private property. And Mary Beard makes this exact point in SPQR, that the program itself is pretty conservative. And what was radical here was really the ferocity of the reaction to it, because there was almost already a legal cap on the books. one traditionally traced back to Licinio-Sextian laws of 367 BC, so more than 2 centuries before Tiberius. It limited how much ager publicus any one person could hold to 500 agera, roughly 300 acres, with a modest allowance on top of that for sons. And that cap had simply been ignored for generations, because the people who'd have to enforce it were the exact same people benefiting from it never being enforced. So all Tiberius proposes is that they actually enforce it. Put a cap on the holdings, reclaim the illegal surplus sitting above that line, and hold it back out as the small allotments to landless citizens. And these allotments are specifically designed to put those men back over the property qualification so they can serve in the legions again. So on paper, he's just implementing a limit that's already sitting there in Roman law. In practice, he's threatening the entire wealth foundation of every senatorial family that's currently parked on illegally held land, which by this point is most of them. So why does the whole Senate go to war over something this modest? Because the senators lining up against Tiberius aren't actually defending some constitutional principle. They're defending property they acquired illegally, property that they came to look legitimate over 2 centuries purely because of convention, passed down through families, folded into inheritances, treated as ancestral estates. 2 full centuries of quiet possession had basically laundered an illegal land grab into something that felt like a birthright. So they dressed the whole fight up as some matter of procedure, of tradition, of this just isn't how we do things around here. They paint Tiberius as reckless, as a demagogue, playing to the mob, as a threat to authority of the Senate itself. Anything at all except the plain truth, which is that his bill would cost them acreage. The constitutional principle they kept invoking is really just a costume thrown over a property interest. And once you can see that, everything that comes next starts to make a very different kind of sense. So this is where the pattern actually kicks off. Tiberius's fellow tribune, a man named Marcus Octavius, vetoes the bill. And constitutionally, that's completely legitimate. Tribunes hold absolute veto power, and it only takes one tribune objecting to kill any measure. That's by design. It's meant to be an emergency brake against any single magistrate who's overreaching. But look at what that veto is actually being used for here. The tribune's office existed to protect ordinary Romans from the Senate. And Octavius, who Plutarch tells us was himself a big holder of public land, and almost certainly coordinating with senatorial interests, is now using that very office against the exact people it was built to protect. The veto was designed to shield ordinary Romans from the Senate, and this is the moment that it quietly stops shielding them and starts shielding the Senate instead. And nobody's calling this a crisis yet. From the outside, it just looks like normal Roman politics. A veto, a disagreement, business as usual. But it's the first quiet violation of the norms. And the part that really matters is that it comes from the Senate's side of the ledger first, before Tiberius has broken a single law. The instrument that's supposed to check power has already been turned into a shield for it. Now, Tiberius has a real choice in front of him. He can accept the veto, work within the Constitution, wait for the next year and bring the bill back, try some different tactics, build his coalition slowly the way Roman politics is supposed to work. And he doesn't. And it's worth sitting with why for a second, before we're too quick to judge him for it, because he's already watched this exact reform effort get quietly strangled through procedure before. So to him, patience looks less like principle and a lot more like just surrendering. So instead, Tiberius does something Rome has no vocabulary for. He puts a direct question to the plebeian council, which is basically, should a tribune who's acting against the interests of the very people he represents be allowed to keep his office? And he has them vote to remove Octavius right in the middle of his term. And this has never been done before. Tribunes serve 1-year terms, and they're not removable by popular vote under any procedure that anyone knows of. There's no procedure for it because nobody ever thought one was necessary. The whole system just quietly assumed that tribunes would go on acting like tribunes. So Tiberius essentially invents a recall live, on the spot, because the outcome matters more to him than the process he has to break to get there. And this is the first big violation of the mos maiorum from the Gracchian side of the ledger. He read the problem correctly. The land crisis is real. The recruiting collapse is real. But the method he's using is now broken. And once it's broken, it sets a precedent. Because the next person who wants to get rid of an inconvenient magistrate now has a template to follow. And then he makes it worse. By long custom, nobody sought immediate re-election to the tribunate. And honestly, whether it was even legal was genuinely up for debate. Tiberius runs again anyway, the very next year. And why does he do that? Because the moment his term is up, he loses sacrosanctity, the personal legal protection that's kept him alive through all of this so far. And he knows exactly how many enemies he's made deposing Octavius and going after their land. Our ancient sources say he genuinely feared he'd be prosecuted, or worse, the second he became a private citizen again. So running again, for him, it's much less about ambition than it is about plain survival. But that is not how the Senate reads it. To them, it reads like a man trying to make himself permanent, trying to lift himself above the normal rotation of Roman office altogether, which is the exact same thing Romans had feared ever since they threw out their kings. So that's the second big violation, and it's the one that finally convinces a critical mass of the Senate that Tiberius has to be stopped by whatever means are available. And this is where Scipio Nasica makes his move. The consul, a man named Scaevola, gets asked by the Senate to use force against Tiberius, and he refuses, because he won't act without due process, no matter what the provocation is. And that refusal actually matters, because it means the Senate never formally authorizes any of this violence. Nasica leads that mob out of the same meeting entirely on his own initiative, straight into an active election. They snap the benches. They beat Tiberius and something like 300 of his supporters to death, and they throw his body into the Tiber. No trial, no burial, and none of the rites which, for a Roman, is the ultimate humiliation, because you're denying the man passage into the afterlife according to their own religious custom. And this is the third violation, and it's the biggest one, because it's the one with the actual blood on it. The Senate as an institution did not vote to kill Tiberius Gracchus in order to save the Republic. A faction inside it, led by its own chief priest, killed him to protect land they'd acquired illegally, and then let the whole thing pass into history as an act of civic virtue. And what makes it matter is less Tiberius himself, and more what happens downstream from here, over the next 100 years. Gaius Gracchus, Tiberius' younger brother, picks the fight back up about a decade later, and he gets killed too, along with thousands of his supporters, in political violence that dwarfs what happened to Tiberius. Marius goes around the traditional property qualification completely, and raises his armies straight from the landless poor, which creates soldiers who are loyal to him personally instead of Rome. And he's citing the very same crisis that Tiberius had put his finger on. Sulla marches on Rome in 88 BC, the first time a Roman general ever leads his legions against the city itself. And he does it because now political violence between citizens is simply how disputes get settled. Caesar crosses the Rubicon in 49 BC, because not done had stopped meaning anything real 2 generations earlier. And every Roman political actor for the next century can point straight back to 133 BC. Every violation has precedent now, and every response also has a precedent. The floor just keeps dropping, and nobody ever again has to be the first person to break a 4-century-old rule, because that has already been paid by Tiberius and Nasica on the very same afternoon. So run the whole thing through the framework that we've been tracking ever since episode 109. Start with the money, the ager publicus wealth capture that caused the crisis to begin with. 2 centuries of an unenforced law turning public land into private fortune. Then the borders, meaning the recruitment collapse that Tiberius was actually trying to fix. That empty countryside and vanishing legionary base. A republic that can't reliably field the army its own conquests demand. And then the power. The tribune's veto getting weaponized in ways the system never anticipated. And from both sides of the fight. First to protect the Senate, then reinvented by Tiberius to take out a rival. 3 fault lines, all cracking in the same decade. All of them converging on that very afternoon. And if you end up with a republic that never really recovers the norms it lost that day, it's because you can't legislate your way back to a rule that only ever worked because everyone quietly agreed, without ever being told, not to break it. So I'm going to keep this next part general on purpose, because naming it too directly would cheapen it. When somebody with a legitimate grievance about reform runs into a system that looks rigged against reform, they end up facing a choice. They can accept the constraint, which means slower and more limited change, working inside rules that may honestly never deliver the fix they're after. Or they can break the norm to force it through. And breaking the norm often does get the substantive thing done, at least in the short term, but it also permanently degrades the constraint that they broke. For everybody. Forever. Including for causes a whole lot less legitimate than their own. Tiberius Gracchus was right about the problem. He'd read the situation correctly. And historians overwhelmingly agree the land crisis and the recruitment collapse were both real and serious. The thing that actually killed the Republic was the specific way that he pushed this through, and then the specific way the Senate chose to answer it. The reform itself, the goal that he was after, was never really the problem, and the equal and opposite lesson matters every bit as much, because the institutional defenders who answer a norm violation with violence, or with counter-violations of their own, degrade the system just as permanently, and sometimes even more so, precisely because they're the ones who are supposed to be upholding it. Scipio Nasica killed Tiberius Gracchus with the stated intention of preserving republican order, and his action did more lasting damage to that order than Tiberius's reforms ever could have, because it proved the unwritten rule, the one that said no political violence against a fellow Roman, was negotiable after all. So you don't need a tyrant to end a republic. What you need instead is someone with a legitimate grievance deciding the normal process is too rigged to bother with, and someone in power deciding that violence is the answer to that. Both halves of that sentence have to be true at once. Rome supplied both of them on the same afternoon for the first time in almost 400 years. And 133 BC doesn't actually end the fight. It just hands it off to Tiberius' younger brother. About 10 years later, Gaius Gracchus wins the tribunate and pushes even bigger reforms. Land, grain subsidies, colonization, a whole overhaul of the jury courts. He goes further than his brother ever did, and he gets killed too, along with thousands of his followers, in violence that makes 133 BC look small by comparison. Every attempt to fix the Republic using the tools the Republic itself hands you ends up doing the Republic more damage. And that's where we're going next time, because from here the whole cycle only speeds up. This has been the Roman Pattern. I'm Jeremy Ryan Slate. Please like this video, leave us a comment, and smash that subscribe button if you want more of the Roman Pattern.